The United States has announced yet another aid package for the Ukraine war. But the key question here is, will it have any impact, and what really is the endgame, and in fact, is there even an endgame? Our next story is about Manipur, India's northeastern state, where a horrific video has brought to the fore once again the issue of ethnic and religious violence in this state. But will this video at least finally force the governments in the state and the country to take some action? This is the Daily Debrief. These are the stories we'll be discussing today. Keep watching. Our first story is from the battlefields of Ukraine, or maybe the boardrooms of those who drive this war. The United States has announced yet another military aid package for the Ukrainians, this time to the tune of 1.2 billion US dollars. Now, we have kind of lost count of the number of such packages. Just a couple of weeks ago, the US said that they would be sending cluster munitions, which are very deadly. But the question that emerges every single time is, what impact does this have? A very basic answer, of course, is that it extends the war. We have been saying this for a while, that this is a war between NATO and Russia, not Ukraine and Russia. But what is the end game here? Or is there even a plan? To answer this puzzling question, we go to NewsClick's Prabir Purkayastha, who has been proved right a lot by histories these days as far as this war is being talked about. Prabir, thank you so much for joining us. So another package of, this time, of $1.3 billion in arms and ammunition, various kinds of counter-drone mechanisms, they call it, for protection of ports and harbors, etc. But we have talked about various aid packages in the past. Is this just one of those, or does it make any difference at all?
The kind of packages is changing, but every day we have announcements of new kinds of arms and ammunition being given. Last couple of weeks back, it was the cluster ammunition, which was being talked about. This time also, there is a whole bunch of things, and I'm not getting into the military aspects of what is what, but essentially it is drones, it is things which will be used to protect as well as attack. Most of it is, as you know, weapons, so they are used for attacking, though they are said it is for defensive purposes always. But therefore, new kinds of weapons are being talked about, but the quantities are not that high, A. B is, it's interesting, instead of drawing down from existing stocks, which is what the United States was doing for quite some time, now they're actually saying we'll procure and give you, which means the equipment has to probably be manufactured in most of the cases, because otherwise it would be in the US stocks much more easily. So the fact that they are starting to talk about procuring, and this has started not just this time, but also earlier, that they've started talking about procuring arms and equipment to give to Ukraine, seems that there is a problem with the existing stocks they have, that if they draw down the stocks further, then they themselves will not have much stocks left. And in fact, the reason for going in for cluster ammunition, in spite of all the criticism that has occurred, was because they've run out of 155 millimeter stocks of shells to give. And that is why cluster ammunition, which they have in large quantities, because US never signed the cluster ammunition pact, like a lot of other countries, including India, China, and Russia. But they're the ones who have used large amounts in Iraq, so therefore they had a large stock of cluster ammunition in any case. So, but what we are seeing is, apart from cluster ammunition, they're not drawing down on their stocks, but asking new manufactured weapons to be supplied, which means there is going to be a time lag. The second part of it is they already have, I think, given over $100 billion. It's very difficult to keep track all of it, because some go as military, some go as non-military aid. So the total amount of aid in Ukraine has always been a bit of a mystery. Of course, there is a Ukraine tracker, which talks about what different kinds of aid and weapons are coming. And then again, what is military and what is non-military is always a bit of a gray area. But looking at what has come in, about $100 billion worth of military supplies are either in the pipeline or have already been supplied to Ukraine. This is military aid in different forms. Then there is a non-military civilian aid, so to say, which is what runs the Ukrainian budget at the moment. And that's also of a very large order. So if we take all of this account, let's face it, Ukraine is today fighting the war and running its own finances as a government based on the total supply that is coming in, financial as well as other supplies that's coming in from the West. Let's put it very clearly, the West, which is really NATO plus. NATO plus would be Australia, New Zealand, of course, doesn't really count. But Japan is a non-NATO but a very close ally, and South Korea and others. So it's that which is sustaining Ukraine. But what is interesting is the amounts are decreasing and they're not drawing down from existing stocks. I think these two are interesting things that we seem to see in what is being on offer currently.
Right, Prabir, but also for the benefit of our viewers who might not be really following the war on a day-to-day or week-to-week basis, is any of this actually making a difference in what is happening on the battlefield? We know that the counteroffensive by Ukraine didn't really sort of work out, but there's been a lot of the day-to-day fighting continues as we've seen. But has all this barrage of ammunitions really meant anything in the larger scheme of the battlefield?
So what we seem to see is a kind of a push and shove at the border in which Ukraine's offensive, which has been talked about for quite some time, now it has finally materialized. Over the last 1 month, we have seen activity, but the front line has hardly moved in any of the places. 3 to 5 kilometers in certain places is the maximum it seems to have reached. And as we know, 3 to 5 kilometers is not even reaching the first line of defense. So, of course, with all the arms and ammunition, you will get into some ground because that's what the other side will let you advance. And then, of course, you encounter the minefields which have been sown, and the artillery and whatever other weapons are brought to bear on you. But most importantly, in this offensives, slowly we are finding armor, which is supposed to be something they have been provided recently, lots of it. They don't seem to be figuring. So what we seem to see are more ground forces. We also don't see any air cover they have. And artillery, of course, and shelling of different kind, drones, all of these are there. But there is hardly any air cover. And of course, the number of armed tanks and armored vehicles that we saw in the initial phase of this new offensive, that seems to have reduced dramatically. And that seems to show that these were not very effective. And now they're doing the old-fashioned attritional war. And in the old-fashioned attritional war, they don't have any advantage over Russia because Russia is able to fire, by all accounts, all the Western accounts, at least 5 times the shells that Ukraine can fire. So if we look at all of this, it's very clear that the offensive has gone into a stalemate mode and it is not really able to advance or make breakthroughs. So what is the next step? More weapons? Doesn't seem to be possible because stocks are getting low. Again, train a new set of people, give them more armor, give them aircraft with which they can strike Russia, give them missiles that they can strike Russia. These are all steps which can lead to either really going off the rails completely and leading to really a war between NATO and Russia, or it looks like the possibility of a longer stalemate. And if the stalemate is not supported by NATO arms and weapons continuously, then it can put Ukraine in really difficult situation. But we have also to accept that the Ukrainians are still fighting. So what it does seem to have happened is there is still a nationalist zeal that we see in Ukraine. And it is true that they are having problems on all counts, but there are still people willing to fight. So that's, I think, something we have to register what's happening on the other side. But at the same time, unless NATO wants to get into the picture and fight on its own, which of course immediately raises the issue of nuclear weapons, I think this doesn't seem to be going in any other direction but a stalemate. And therefore, the talks about starting the negotiations, seeing what will happen, all this are slowly starting to percolate even in the West, who all the media over there, which had been declaring only victory and nothing else, which is what Biden has been saying continuously, I think all those are sort of slowly changing their tonality a bit. Is it significant shift? Not as yet. Will it shift in the coming days? Yes, because various defense experts are starting to say that we are not in a position to fight an industrial scale war, which is what we have talked about quite some time back, that this is the basic problem that they're facing, that they are prepared to fight in Afghanistan against weak Saddam Hussein and much bigger firepower. But when it comes to a pure industrial power like Russia or in the future like China, then that doesn't seem to be something that the United States is geared up for. And I think the Ukraine war has brought that message home. So how long it can continue, we don't know. Have they won a victory? Yes, over Western Europe, but not over Russia. But yes, I think the first day somebody said that this is United States defeats Germany once again, okay, for the third time. First World War, Second World War, and this is the third time. So I think that's what we see, that there is, yes, Western Europe seems to have lost and lost quite decisively in this particular battle. And that's something we'll have to see how the Western European people react to this.
Prabir, we were joking yesterday that while Latin America is resisting the Monroe Doctrine, it looks like Europe is wholeheartedly embracing its own version of it. And that's what you seem to be indicating as well. Thank you so much for talking to us, and we'll get back to you in later episodes on these issues and more. Our next story is from India's northeastern state of Manipur, which has been torn apart by religious and ethnic violence for over 2 months now. On Wednesday, a video emerged, a very brutal video of two women from the Kuki community being paraded naked and assaulted by a mob. Now, this video was from May 4th, and it turns out that while a police complaint was filed, no one was arrested until after the video came out. That's recently. This brutal incident took place in the context of weeks of horrific violence in which close to 150 people have been killed, houses and places of worship burned down, and people forced to flee. To understand this conflict and the response of the governments concerned, we go to Pragya. Pragya, so thank you so much for joining us. Like I said, a very disturbing video, of course, and we have talked about this issue has been talked about in the media for a long time. The violence, especially the very gendered nature of violence, the ethnic nature of violence. But to sort of give our viewers, especially from abroad, a bit of context, could you explain what really is happening in the state of Manipur? It's in India's northeast, a small state, but a lot has been happening there.
Right, Prashant. So, on May 3rd, a series of events basically came to a head. There are two communities of Manipur, the Kuki community, which is a tribal or indigenous group, and the Meitei community, which is, broadly speaking, a Hindu group, which is the majority religion of India. So they ended up having a conflict. The trigger was a very recent High Court order, which has to do with the status of the Kuki groups as an indigenous community. Now, this status is conferred by the Indian Constitution, and there is a process by which you are put on the list or excluded from the list and so on. But this is a running dispute between the two communities. The Meiteis are the dominant community numerically, but they're also very well represented in the assembly of the state. The Kuki community is definitely a backward community compared with the Meitei. They're very, very behind the times in terms of education, in terms of the assets they have, and so on. But in order to live and survive and sort of thrive in Manipur, you have to be in the valley, which is where the Meiteis live. Now, it's actually like the capital of the state, so it's a melting pot, but India is not new to a sort of ethnic divide or a religious divide or even conflict on, for that matter. What is unusual about this case is that the government responded in ways which actually seem to have fueled the tensions between the two communities. When the violence began, there are complaints from the members of the Kuki community who live in Imphal city that they were not helped. Now, the government, the central government and the state government have at least 10,000 military and paramilitary people helping.
And they're both ruled by the BJP, Bharatiya Janata Party.
That's right. I mean, you cannot forget that the party ruling at the center is ruling in the state. And, they keep talking about this, something called the double engine government, which means that, everything that you can expect the central government to give you, and the state government to help implement those projects and plans will be delivered to the people. But the Kuki community found itself really on a very back foot, and they were attacked. There were attacks on churches. Now there is an expectation that the Prime Minister would step in and say something. He has now spoken out, which is after that video, the gruesome video you talk about, has been released. Interestingly, the video is not from where we are actually finding out that these incidents have happened. For any state government, which is, or for the central government, which is ruling over a country as complex as India, that conflict is where women become the most vulnerable. Instead of having taken measures to prevent further steps, you actually ended up ignoring it. That is being the absolutely clear complaint of the Kuki community. The Meitei community has its own concerns, which they have also been voicing, but the chief minister belongs to the Meitei community. There is a suspicion that he backs his own community rather than look at justice and sorting out the problem. Now, the communities are completely divided. There was what some people called a natural divide. They lived in different parts of the state. The hilly part is where the tribal communities live. The plains part is where Imphal, the state capital, is where the Meiteis live. But they were in a melting pot situation in Imphal, and that has ended. So when communities get divided completely, and then you have 2 months later a state acknowledging, the Prime Minister acknowledging a gruesome brutality, which the community has been talking about all along, it just sends a terrible message.
Right. So, Pragya, in this context, of course, you also talked to people who are affected on both sides. You've also written about it. So, I think one of the key aspects here is that while there are a lot of constitutional issues and issues of justice, which are very quite complicated, and I think even the influx of refugees from Myanmar is also a factor which is playing into this, etc., etc. But the fundamental question here, like you pointed out, remains one of justice, and for one, stopping the violence, and two, arresting perpetrators who have been accused of many of these crimes, and three, trying to bring the situation. So why has there been a failure on that aspect? It's a tough question, but why is there...
Really, it's tough, but it's also very easy. It's politics, really. It's... yes, like you mentioned, there is migration from across the Indian border, which Manipur is on the border with Myanmar, and people from the same ethnic group who speak the same language as well do migrate into India. Nobody denies that the Indian state or the state of Manipur might have its own concerns related to security, safety, and the well-being of its people. But it's also a fact that nobody has stopped the Indian state from taking measures to prevent and maybe document the extent of this violence. Now, the data, extent of this migration across the border. Now, the data from 2011 census, which is the last data we have, does not show that there is a improbable increase in the population of any of the tribal groups of Manipur, and not of the Kukis either. So the claims are not founded on fact, but there is a lot of propaganda about foreigners coming into the state of Manipur and taking away its resources, planting poppy, which is used to cultivate drugs, and so on and so forth. So you're maligning a community. You're not based on fact, and the state government is not stepping in to really prevent that. In fact, there are forces aligned with the state government who are also armed and who are said to be responsible for some of the violence that happened in Manipur after 3rd May, who have been leveling these accusations on some pretty mainstream television channels, both in Manipur and, in the mainstream. So in English, in Hindi, in different languages. So they are spreading their message very far and wide. It's a message of divide. And if you do have a problem with infiltration, the Kuki response has been to say that, well, that doesn't mean that you pick up the gun and start killing us. Right? And even the measures which are proposed to control the so-called immigration, for which we have no evidence, is to have something called the National Register of Citizens, which, it's too long a background to go into, but it could prove, if the government does agree to such a measure, it could prove to be even more divisive. It could prove to be something where you end up excluding people. Now look at the situation. The Kuki tribals who were living in the Imphal Valley have been forced to flee. And the Meiteis, who were living alongside the Kuki tribals in the hill areas, have also been forced to flee. There's a complete divide. Houses have been burned, churches have been set afire, a lot of vandalism and looting. These people would not have their documents with them.
Absolutely.
So how are you going to implement a system which is going to be able to weed out the citizens from the non-citizens? Also, the other concern, which is increasing concern, is that the Kuki tribals, who make up about 15% of the population, are not the only tribal group in Manipur. There are other ethnic identities which which go across the state border within India and with the neighboring countries. Now, there are international organizations which each of these bodies have for exactly that reason that Southeast Asian countries are very closely linked culturally, linguistically, ethnically with many populations of India. So if you continue to stoke these, or if you don't prevent people from, or find a way for them to come together to the table, there is no news of any discussion going on about actually finding a way to peace. Right? And, in the meantime, the Kuki tribals have also demanded that they should get a separate administration or a separate state.
Which is a natural progression of this kind of, I think, an approach to addressing the issues. That
Yes,
ultimately people decide that we can't
stay
coexist.
together.
Yes, exactly.
It is natural for an angry people or a people who feel they've been persecuted to say that we can't be with you, whoever that might be. But it's also the job of the state to ensure that,
things don't come to pass.
That pass, and, you have to overcome feelings. At least the elders of the communities get together, sit and talk. It's also important, like you said, that this is not just an ethnic struggle. This is also religious. It has religious overtones, very strong overtones. Some of the Meiteis, groups who claim to represent all the Meiteis, which they certainly do not, are armed, and they propose going back to a very ancient form of Meitei religion. So there are concerns that over time the conflict will become something among Meiteis as well. So in an area which has every community and a large number of them living together, it's important for not just the government but also the media and the people of that region to figure out why they could stay together and why they are suddenly fighting.
Right. Absolutely. Thank you so much, Pragya. It's, of course, a very complicated topic and I think a lot of aspects to go into. But it does seem like, as far as the government is concerned, definitely a big issue in terms of errors of omission here, if not errors of commission. And one definitely section saying that there are errors of commission, mistake or steps actively taken by the government which worsen the situation as well.
Right.
So thank you so much for talking to us.
Most welcome.
So that's all we have time for today. Do keep watching Daily Debrief. Visit our website, peoplesdispatch.org, and follow us on all the social media platforms.